Okay, your reading assignment for our next class covers a lot of basic genetics, which is actually not something that we are focusing on in this class. For Bio 150, you don't need to know a lot of detail about DNA structure, Mendelian genetics, or the steps of meiosis. However, you need to understand the basics about these things to understand some of the bigger picture concepts that we'll talk about this semester. So the purpose of this video is to give you an idea of how much detail I do want you to know from the reading that you did for our next class. So before you come to class next Tuesday, I want you to be able to explain how DNA contributes to the phenotype of an organism and how DNA is transmitted from parent to offspring. And if this new information is new to you, or if you haven't had biology in a long time, then I suggest that you watch this a couple of times and go back and read the section of the book that are relevant to what I talk about here to make sure that you're ready to start building on this in class. Okay, so let's get started. Hopefully a lot of you recognize this molecule on the left as a DNA molecule, and before I jump in and start talking about genetics, I want to point out that one of the big ideas, or the FBIs, in this course is related to how information, and DNA in particular, is exchanged between organisms and used to direct organism function. So I want to talk about this first. DNA is found in all of our cells and can be thought of as the blueprint of life. And what I mean by that is that DNA contains all of the information needed to build and maintain an organism. And when we consider individual organisms, we will talk a lot about phenotypes. So I want to go ahead and define that. An individual's phenotype includes all of its observable traits. So if we think just about humans, even though there are a lot of similarities between us, there are also some obvious differences you can note when comparing any two humans. And the similarities between us in terms of our phenotypes are due to the fact that we share a lot of our DNA in common. And to a large degree, subtle differences in our DNA are responsible for differences between individuals' phenotypes. For example, skin color, hair color, eye color, height, and things like that. So if we compare humans to other species, there are even larger differences in phenotypes that we can observe, and these are due to much larger differences in our DNA, in the DNA between us and these other species. So how do we get from DNA to an individual with a particular phenotype? To understand that, we need to go back and learn a little bit about the structure of DNA. So if we look back at the DNA molecule, you'll notice that it has the shape of a double helix, and it's made up of a sugar phosphate backbone. So this red part on the diagram, this is the backbone. And then there are nucleotide bases connecting the two backbones together, kind of like rungs on a ladder. So you can see all of these, the blue and the green rungs here holding the backbones together. So you'll notice that the bases are labeled either A, T, C, or G. And the A's are always paired with the T's, so that's adenine and thymine. And the C's are always paired with the G's, so cytosine and guanine are always paired together. So the sections of DNA that contain information that serve as this blueprint for building an organism are called genes. So a gene is just a section of DNA that codes for building proteins. And the nucleotide bases in particular are the part of the DNA molecule that contain the information to do this. So the way this works is that the body uses one side of the DNA molecule as a template and then reads along these nucleotide bases. So what I've done here is just laid the DNA strand out horizontally so you can see it more clearly. And the nucleotide bases that you see here can be read like an alphabet. So all of the words contained in our DNA are made up of 3 letters, and so these words we actually call codons, and each codon tells the body to produce a particular amino acid. So the cell's machinery goes along this strand, reads it out, and then attaches the appropriate amino acids together to form a protein. And this protein then gets used for some particular function in the body. So proteins play important roles in maintenance and growth of organisms, And for that reason, they then contribute directly to the phenotype of an organism. And just to think about a concrete example here, we can think about a mouse that has a gene that controls for fur color. So depending on the sequence of nucleotide bases that the mouse has on that gene, it will code for a particular version of, in this case, a melanocortin receptor, which just is used to bind pigment in the mouse's fur. So this version of the gene with this particular series of nucleotide bases ends up coding for this particular set of amino acids that then produces dark fur in the mouse. And however, we could have another mouse with a different version of this gene that, in other words, a different series of nucleotide bases that produces a different protein that then codes for light fur. So depending on the sequence of nucleotides, you can get different phenotypes in these mice. So the way that DNA is packaged in our cells is not in these long, unraveled strands of DNA. Instead, DNA is condensed in the form of chromosomes. So this is a diagram showing you two homologous chromosomes. In other words, two chromosomes that contain the same genes. And so what we can imagine is if we're looking at one of these chromosomes, you can imagine that if we were to zoom way in on this chromosome, we could see the double helix structure of the DNA. But from this zoomed out point of view, we can still point out the regions of the chromosome or DNA that make up the different genes. So here, what we're pointing out here is a gene for eye color. So if we're thinking about a gene for eye color in humans, humans and most other sexually reproducing organisms are diploid, meaning they have two copies of every chromosome. So what this means is that we also have two copies of every gene in our body. So if we think about the simple example of a gene that controls for eye color, you can see that the top chromosome here has an allele or a version of the gene that codes for brown eyes. And then the bottom chromosome here has a different allele, and we know that just because it's colored a different color here. And this allele or version of the gene codes for blue eyes. And to make things simple, we can give these different letters. So we can think about this, the series of nucleotide bases that produces brown eyes, we can just call it big B, and then the allele down here that produces blue eyes, we can call it little b. So since you have two different alleles for every gene, the combination of alleles that you have for a given gene is called a genotype. And your genotype, or both alleles, controls the phenotype of eye color. In this example, because there are only two alleles possible for this gene, big B and little b, individuals can have only one of three different genotypes. So they can be either big B, and have this big B allele on both of their chromosomes, be big B, which we see in this case, or they can have two little b alleles. So if, in this example, the big B is dominant over the little b allele, then anyone with at least one copy of the big B allele would have brown eyes, and only individuals that have two copies of the little b allele would end up with blue eyes. So if we think of traits like this, so eye color, hair color, what we see is that individuals often resemble their parents, and that is because offspring inherit their DNA and their genes from their parents. So for the last part of this video, I just want to briefly go over how parents pass their genetic material on to their offspring, and this corresponds with the reading that you did on meiosis. So, meiosis is the process by which adults produce gametes, either eggs or sperm. And as we talked about before, diploid organisms contain two copies of each chromosome in all of their cells. So here we're looking at a cell with two copies of a chromosome, one colored red and the other blue. And at the beginning of meiosis, each chromosome replicates, so there are two copies of each chromosome. Then the cell divides, splitting the homologous chromosomes into different cells, And in the last step, these two split apart so that each daughter cell ends up with just one copy of the chromosome. So every sperm and every egg produced by males and females has half of the genetic material needed to form a new individual. You can see down here, each of these have just one chromosome, whereas up here we had two copies of the chromosome. In sexually reproducing organisms, new individuals are formed when an egg and sperm fuse during fertilization. So in this process, each gamete contributes one chromosome. So the zygote that results is again diploid and contains genetic information that comes half from the mother and half from the father. And I just want to point out, in this example, we are looking at a cell that has only one pair of homologous chromosomes. Many organisms actually have more than one pair of chromosomes, so you can scale this up to consider all the possible pairs. Okay, so that concludes this video, and I just want to return to what I wanted you to get out of this. So you should now be able to explain how DNA contributes to the phenotype of an organism and how DNA is transmitted from parent to offspring.